On this week's GCN Racing news show, incredible celebrations and a crash fest at the European Championships in Namur, a brand new pro team, Bianchi, back in the pro peloton, Jay Vine on the move to UAE, plus an intense sketching fight in Japan as Froome and Vingegaard square up against Valverde and Nibali. This week in the world of racing, we learned that Puk Pieter's victory celebration is the best we have seen in years. Here she is crossing the finish line to win the under-23 European cyclocross title in Namur yesterday. Fair play, that is seriously impressive. We also learned that Doug Ryder is back with the brand new Q36.5 team with Vincenzo Nibali alongside him as technical director and brand ambassador. More details to follow later on in the show. And finally this week, we learnt that the Namur cyclocross circuit never disappoints. I have to say, it was a cracking weekend of racing in the south of Belgium for the European Cyclocross Championships at the weekend. It all kicked off with the under-23 men's event on Saturday, in which the Belgians spent most of the race playing catch-up to Pim Ronhaar of the Netherlands. The Dutchman had caught and passed a trio of Belgians by the end of the second lap, and looked like he was, on some parts of the course, literally running away with it. But he didn't, and it culminated in one of the best final laps of cyclocross action that I've seen in quite some time. Thibaut Nys was gradually making his way back to the front of the race after a problem early on, but the first to catch Ronhaar was actually the Belgian national champion Emil Verstringer. Now, the decisive moment came on the notoriously sketchy descent down to the cobbled climb, where Verstringer opened up daylight between himself and Ronhaar, who was clearly starting to pay for his earlier efforts. Before we knew it, Nys himself was interviewing and overtaking the Dutchman, and it looked as though it might all come down to the wire. However, Verstringer had enough left in the tank to keep his countrymen at bay, but it was a 1-2 for Belgium, and actually a third place too, as Witzer Merson also rode past Ronhaar, who would slip from first back to fifth over the final lap of the race. Later that day, it was the turn of the elite women. Fem van Empel, who's won 7 of the 8 races that she'd started up to that point of the season, started as the big favourite, quite obviously. Now, an early puncture for her threw up a few question marks, but thankfully she wasn't far from the pits at that point, so could quickly change her bike. It did leave her with ground to make up, but it wasn't long until she was back at the head of the race. Now, for a long time, she was pushed quite hard by Ceylin Del Carmen Alvarado, but Van Empel's strength this year has been the ability to up her pace in the closing stages, and on Saturday, she did exactly that on the penultimate lap of the race, leaving Alvarado in her wake. Now, such was her lead as the bell rung that she was able to ride a measured final lap, eventually crossing the line 21 seconds ahead of the fellow Dutchwoman Alvarado, with Blanka Vash of Hungary coming home a further 15 seconds back to claim the bronze medal. So it's now 8 wins from 9 races for Van Empel this season. She looks to be in a league of her own right now. Further down the order, world champion Marianne Vos, who had a great start to the race, would have to settle for 9th eventually, which was 2 places behind former world champion Pauline Ferrand-Prévot. Lucinda Brand was unable to take the start as she'd hoped to last week. She's still recovering from her fractured wrist, and that, I think, was probably a wise decision given the nature of the course in Namur. Now, the 2 women who may have pushed Van Empel closest on Saturday both decided to compete at the under-23 race yesterday. Puk Pieter and defending champion Shirin van Anrooy started the race as the big favourite, but an early incident saw Van Anrooy drop outside the top 10. Now, in complete contrast, Pieter had a very smooth start, and she was already clear of the rest by 20 seconds at the end of lap 1. And as much as we might have hoped we had a race in our hands, we didn't really. Pieter didn't put a foot wrong. She was extremely strong and technically brilliant. And to underline the latter, her victory celebration was something else. A one-handed wheelie, and not just for a fleeting moment, for a good few seconds on her way to the finish line. I mean, that is seriously impressive at any time, but at the end of a cyclocross race that tough? I'll tell you what, women's cyclocross has come on to another level this year. We are witnessing, I think, a changing of the guard. The more experienced riders, I think, are going to find it very tough to get back to winning, even when they do get back to top form or back from injury, as is the case for Brandt. The final event of the weekend was the elite men's, where conditions were made even tougher after a torrential downpour soon after the under-23 women's event. Elizabeth started as the main favourite, but it was Lars van der Haar who'd taken the most recent win. More on that later on. Now, Elizabeth did get off to a very good start, but then it all started to go wrong for him on the first off-camber section, where he lost a lot of time. Sadly, he would eventually have to abandon the race following a crash. Van der Haar, though, took full advantage, carving out a 7-second advantage by the end of the opening lap. But that lead was then extinguished through a crash on the second lap, and he was soon signalling to his pit crew that he needed a different setup on his bike. It left Michael van Torenhout and Van der Haar out front, but the third lap was mayhem. With conditions worsening, almost all the front runners ended up on their arses down the most technical descent on the course, but it was the same two riders battling it out at the head of the race. A puncture for Van der Haar saw him lose a little ground, but it was this fall on the penultimate lap that it was his final undoing. Now, despite his best efforts, the Dutchman was unable to regain contact with Van Torenhout, who was nailing almost every section of the course. So, a Belgian win, but perhaps not the man we expected to be on top of the podium. That said, Van Torenhout is a previous winner in Namur and more than deserving of the European title yesterday. Fellow Belgian Laurens Sweeck rounded out the podium with third on the day, over 2 minutes down, with Joris Nieuwenhuis fourth and Kevin Kern in fifth. But what a cracking weekend of racing. I thoroughly enjoyed that, I've got to say. A few days earlier, it was the first round of the X2O Trophy, in this instance better known as the Koppenbergcross. In the women's race, many eyes were on Pauline Ferrand-Prévot, who was making her return to the discipline for the first time in over 2.5 years. Unfortunately, we didn't really get to see how well she might have done. She had a drivetrain problem early on in the race, which cost her an awful lot of time. She eventually decided to run to the pits, where her crew made a real bodge of the bike change, not taking the bike towards her to reduce how much running she had to do to start with, and then standing on the wrong side of it, so she had to get around her bike in order to jump back on it. Definitely some work to do for the Ineos off-road team. That was less marginal gain and more humongous loss. Anyway, she did eventually get herself back into the top 10, only for another mechanical to scupper that result in the last lap of the race. Up front, well, have a guess. Fem van Empel soon found herself alone off the front and never looked to be in the slightest bit of trouble throughout the race. Denise Betsema finished closest to her, 53 seconds down, with Van Anrooy in third. In the men's, it was a much closer battle. With Sweeck absent, we had a big battle between the Trek Baloise Lions and Power Sows and Bingo. Thibaut Nys had a particularly strong opening few laps, but once we got deeper into the race, it was the usual suspects who emerged at the front: Elizabeth, Van Torenhout and Van der Haar. Now, it looked as though the Bingo boys would be able to work over Van der Haar, who found himself with a reasonably big gap to close to Van Torenhout on the final lap. But not only did he close that gap, he also had enough strength left to sprint up the Koppenberg and gap both Elizabeth and Van Torenhout by 5 and 11 seconds respectively. It was quite the finish. Well done to you, Lars. Right, cyclocross continues this week on GCN Plus with the second round of the Super Prestige Series in Niel this Friday, and then the fifth round of the World Cup from Beekse Bergen on Sunday. As a reminder, the Super Prestige is available to watch worldwide, excluding Belgium, whilst the World Cups are only available in Europe, excluding Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Italy and the host nation, which in this instance is the Netherlands. It's not all about cyclocross this week though. The UCI Track Champions League is back for a much anticipated second series, which starts this Saturday in Palma, Mallorca. Both the sprint and endurance riders have been confirmed now, and we've got some great names competing over the 5 events. Reigning UCI World and Olympic champion Jennifer Valenti is among the 18 riders named on the women's endurance list, joining fellow Olympic gold medalist Katie Archibald and Dame Laura Kenny, two-time European champion Rachele Barbieri, and current Commonwealth Games gold medalist Chloe Moran. On the men's side, we've got Dylan Bibic and Oliver Wood, who both won titles at the recent World Championships, whilst Gavin Hoover is back to defend his UCI Track Champions League title from last year. Jeffrey Hoagland, who won his 7th rainbow jersey at the World Champs, and Thomas Cornish, who helped his nation to victory in the team sprint event, are among the 18 riders named on the men's sprint list. Fellow world champions Harry Lavrayson and Matthew Richardson are also going to be competing. The women's sprint list features yet more world champions, including Pauline Grabosch and Taki Marie Divine Kouame. Leah Friedrich is also there, as well as Mathilde Gross. Live coverage will kick off on Saturday night from 18:30 CET, 17:30 GMT, and will be available in all GCN Plus territories. It is going to be action-packed that evening, so make sure you don't miss it if you've got the time. We've also got some events with a bit of a difference for you on GCN Plus this week, in the form of the UCI BMX Freestyle Flatland Trials and Park World Championships. They run from Friday through to Sunday, and they're going to be available to watch in Europe, excluding Denmark, Norway, Sweden and Italy. Our documentary this week is called Rough Diamond, and in that we follow Josh Stewart as he chases his dream of becoming a professional cyclist. He employed the help of high-performance coaches, a team of performance researchers and aerodynamic optimisation specialists to give himself the best chance at realising his pro cycling dream. Here's your sneak peek.
Now is really my last opportunity to be the cyclist that I know I can be.
Josh will spend the next 6 months training at an elite level.
Come on, Josh! Keep them up! Go, go!
He'll employ the latest technology to find him the biggest gains.
The difference between you holding a relaxed hood position and an aero hood position was over 50 watts.
Can he secure the pro race contract that could change his life?
This is something that I've dreamt about ever since I started cycling.
That documentary will be released for you all to watch from tomorrow, and please let us know what you think. Just before I move on to other news, I'll quickly wrap up the 3 days of cyclocross racing from Falmouth at the weekend. The Pan American Championships followed by the final 2 rounds of the US CX Series. Raylin Nuss retained her Pan American title in the women's race, finishing ahead of Canadian pairing of Sydney McGill and Magali Rochette. Caroline Mani, being French, was unable to compete in that championship, but she won on both Saturday and Sunday, and with that, she took a comfortable overall win in the series. On the men's side, it was the perfect 3 days for Eric Brunner. He won all 3 days of racing. The 23-year-old won the Pan American Championships just under a year ago for the first time, but despite his incredible weekend, he wasn't quite able to overhaul Curtis White in the overall USCX series. Just 3 points separated the two of them after the 8 rounds. Moving on, it was the Saitama criterium at the weekend. The race was won by Jasper Philipsen, but the most intense competition came in a sketching match. Jonas Vingegaard and Chris Froome versus Alejandro Valverde and Vincenzo Nibali. And from what I can gather, each had to sketch a bike and rider in a certain period of time, and the results were mixed, shall we say. Vincenzo Nibali's effort was particularly impressive. Final score, 13-4 in favour of Nibali and Valverde. I think we can safely call that a trouncing. In other news, we have ourselves a brand new team on the block. Last week I spoke about the rumours surrounding the Q36.5 team, which was officially launched at the weekend. The team is backed by Italian clothing company Q36.5, which in turn is partly owned by billionaire Ivan Glasenberg. At the helm is Doug Ryder, formerly of Quebecer Assos and MTN Quebecer, with Vincenzo Nibali employed as technical manager and kind of sponsor liaison. The names I rattled off last week turned out to be correct, so Moschetti, Brambilla, Bauer and Howson are the headline names. They will start out life as a pro team, which is cycling's second division. The other big news last week was that Jay Vine is moving to UAE Team Emirates after all. That was a rumour that was circulating a few weeks ago that Vine himself then went on to quash, only to later confirm it was indeed true. He leaves Alpecin-Deceuninck after 2 very successful years with them. What will be interesting is to see how much freedom he gets to ride for himself next year. You'd presume that he has, in part at least, been employed for the help that he'll be able to give the likes of Pogacar at the Grand Tours. Watch this space, I guess. Alessandro De Marchi, who was yet to find a contract until very recently, is now confirmed as heading to Team Bike Exchange, while Simon Pelot has broken his contract with Trek Segafredo with mutual consent from the team in order to head over to the Tudor Pro Cycling Squad, which is being run by Fabian Cancellara. In bike sponsorship news, we are going to see the welcome return of Bianchi to the Pro Peloton next year. They were absent in 2022 after Bike Exchange moved to Giant Bikes, but they will be ridden by the riders of Arkea Samsic from the start of 2023. Talking of Arkea Samsic, Nairo Quintana lost his appeal against his disqualification from this year's Tour de France. The decision was upheld at the Court of Arbitration for Sport. Quintana was found with traces of tramadol in 2 samples taken at the race, and whilst it's not on the WADA ban list, it is forbidden by the UCI. Right, that is all for this week's Racing News Show, but I'll be back same time, same place next week. See you then.